And welcome to today's webinar by the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Deckel. This briefing is part of a series of discussions JPC is hosting called The Scoop on Annexation or Sovereignty. With President Trump's Jerusalem envoy at the White House and an expected announcement by the president himself in the next few days or even today, and with the July 1st date approaching, Israelis are continuing to ask themselves what leaders have planned for us. With us is the co-author of a paper titled Phased Territorial Implementation of the Trump Plan, submitted to decision makers last month by the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, JISS. Colonel retired Dr. Eran Lerman, who worked for many years in Israel's security establishment and is well-versed in Israel's foreign policy, joins us today. Dr. Lerman was Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office. He's held senior posts in IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. Dr. Lerman is Vice President of the JISS and teaches at Shalem College in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv University, and the National Defense College. Eran, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Talia, for having me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what you guys have been up to before we dive into next week's announcement. According to your policy paper, the Peace to Prosperity Plan, and I quote, is the most realistic route for progress towards a two-state solution. How do you explain this when the Palestinians themselves have rejected it completely?
Well, you know the Israeli fascination with shorthands with three letters, and my specific one is the EKP, the Everybody Knows Paradigm, which is the key to understanding why the Trump plan, the deal of the century, peace to prosperity, whatever you want to call it, is a very important departure in itself, crucial for the prospect actually of moving out of the deadlock into which we have found ourselves now for a good part of 20 years and into new possibilities. And therefore, phased implementation of the Trump concept is a way forward, not a way backward. I know that this sounds counterfactual or counterintuitive to people who are focused upon the current anger and frustration coming from the Palestinian side. But the Palestinians have locked themselves into unrealistic expectations. And these unrealistic expectations have been the major roadblock over the last decade and more to all the attempts to break out and come to some kind of a negotiated agreement. So we need to come out of that, not by, this is not a story about a unilateral step. This is not Israel just taking something. It is part and parcel of putting the Trump plan, the template of change on the table and leaving it open for the Palestinians to negotiate. It is something that could happen tomorrow. Secretary Pompeo has just been saying, and I believe that this is the upshot from the consultations in the White House. First of all, let the Palestinians have an opportunity to come to the table. Then the clock stops. If not, if they do not, if they continue to stick to the position of rejectionism that has marked their attitude since they broke the Kerry negotiations back in 2014, then perhaps the one way forward is to change realities on the ground, and while leaving open the possibility of negotiations on the two-state solution down the road.
Okay, thank you. We've spent weeks hearing from a range of former security officials and policy advisors about the potential dangers of Israel declaring sovereignty over parts of the West Bank. Your paper, however, calls for Israel to follow through with the move in strategic locations, including the Jordan Valley and areas near Jerusalem like Ma'ale Adumim and the Etzion block. Can you elaborate on why these areas are of particular importance?
Definitely. I think two main guidelines should determine the scope of our immediate action at this stage. First of all, security considerations. Because if we stand strictly on security considerations, which are absolutely vital to our future, to the stability of Jordan, and even, if I dare say so, to the safety and security of the Palestinian state or entity itself, because if we are not there, the likelihood of very dangerous developments, even for them, would become much higher. If we stand on security issues, on things that can be explained and reasoned on the basis of security considerations, I think we stand a better chance of making others understand why we are doing what we are doing. Moreover, we need to remain as much as possible, and this is a point that the Prime and myself have made in the paper quite clearly, within the scope of what we can call national cohesion in Israel. National unity is a political, technical term, but national cohesion, which in other words means the support of as much of Israeli society as possible. When we asked questions specific to our concept, we gained the impression that a solid majority of Israelis support that idea. There are loud voices from the hard right rejecting the plan and rejecting the Trump plan, and therefore also rejecting the implementation of Israeli law. There are, of course, voices from the left, center left and left, who think that we should hold out indefinitely for a Palestinian willingness to compromise. We doubt if that's a viable proposition. But a very large majority of mainstream Israeli forces, and of course this government, which comprises elements of the center left, and the center right, seem to be in a new position. If until now we had a division of Israeli politics, sort of carved right down the middle, I think we are beginning to look at a large middle, a left which says, let's give the Palestinians what they want, and a hard right which says, let's give the Palestinians nothing. And to break out of these two positions, we need to latch on to the American plan as it stands.
Okay, a little bit later, we would like to expand on public opinion, as you've touched on it. But in the meantime, specifically about the areas we discussed, you mentioned their strategic importance in terms of security, but one would argue that these areas are already under Israel's control. So why is official recognition so crucial?
Well, here and there, throughout our history, people have raised the idea that maybe our security borders should be different from our sovereignty borders. Some people, in a very artificial way, have tried to interpret Yitzhak Rabin's speech in the Knesset in October '95 to that effect. He said a security border on the River Jordan. But he meant a sovereign border, clearly, because that was the context of his entire discussion. We think that this is a very bad idea, to actually sustain Israeli forces for a prolonged period of time in territories in which Israel does not have sovereignty. Very quickly, not sooner, not at the fullness of time, but almost immediately, the pressures will begin. The attacks, the legal questions, the civic actions, whatever. In areas in which we are not sovereign, our forces will constantly be harassed one way or the other. And at the end, this will become an untenable proposition. I've seen this happen in history again and again, even in countries where foreign forces came as friends, let alone in the context of a historical conflict. So the pressure for us to leave the Jordan Valley and the areas around Jerusalem, if we are not sovereign there, will become intolerable over time. So if we are to move from the present situation to a new situation, I think we need to make this position very clear right away, that these areas need to remain sovereign Israeli territory.
Understood. Do you think that the Americans will only agree to recognition of these minimal pockets of land in order to appease the Israeli government, if you know, ticking a box, if you will, or is there another explanation?
So, politics have a way of coloring strategic decisions, and I'm not sure I can speak to the current state of American politics, which are in terrible flux from all directions. American society seems to be torn. Dynamics within the administration are not always transparent, and of course in Israel too. What happens between parties and between individuals who are in key positions is not entirely free from political considerations. But we believe at JISS, and we're not the only ones. I've seen more, such voices elsewhere quite clearly, and we believe, as I said, that this is the position of the majority of Israelis. That if we stand on clear and well-defined principles, such as security needs, then the American administration will also swing behind it. And while the Arab world will, of course, go through the expected motions and voice its dismay, the key players may come to understand that this is being done because we actually have common security interests with the key players. Jordan is an interesting case. I mean, they will make noises. They have no choice. They live in a neighborhood which obliges them to make noises. But do they really want to ever see Israel depart from the Jordan Valley? I don't believe so. I think it is vital to the stability of the kingdom in two respects. First of all, if things go wrong on the Palestinian side and Islamist Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or what terrorism and subversion begin to seep over from west to the east of the river, and also if the Palestinian Authority is a tempting target for penetration by terrorist organizations, by terrorist supporting nations like Iran, then they would need to destabilize Jordan in order to have a stepping stone on their march to Jerusalem. And therefore our presence in the Jordan Valley is a deterrent, not only in terms of our own security, but also in terms of Jordanian stability. And as I said, ultimately even of the Palestinians' capacity to live a normal life side by side with Israel.
So you then don't see any danger to the continuation of Israel's peace agreement with Jordan, even though the Hashemite kingdom has been for decades considered the patron of the Palestinians?
Well, I think the Jordanian kingdom would need to be reassured by Israel that we are committed to pursuit of the Trump plan in all its implications, including Palestinian independence down the road, and that we have no intention of annexing the West Bank and push in its entirety and pushing the Palestinian population over to the east side of the river. These commitments need to be clear, crystal clear, and binding on our part. I think these are the main concerns. These are the real concerns. There are elements in Israel who would want a solution based on the uprooting of the Palestinians and the destabilization of Jordan. Jordan is Palestine. But this is clearly no longer the position of any elements in the Israeli mainstream. And I think there are ways of making this very clear to the Jordanians.
So we talked about Jordan a lot. You did touch very briefly on the Arab states in general. We haven't seen that many active responses by Sunni states in the region, except for the occasional verbal reprimand or warning, but no tangible action taken by states, whether with this happening or perhaps earlier actions by the Trump administration, like the transfer of the embassy to Jerusalem, or even the elimination, even their removal from the Iran deal. Why is this, and can we expect their complacency to continue?
I'm not sure I would use the term complacency. The point is that they have a very clear order of priorities. Egypt has, forgive the imagery, bigger fish to fry, sweetwater fish on the Nile facing Ethiopia, and saltwater fish in the Mediterranean facing Turkish subversion and intervention, outright intervention in Libya. These are big existential issues for Egypt. By the way, the Turkish conduct in the Eastern Mediterranean is also a very important question for us. It brings us together with Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, France, in a struggle which may determine the nature of the neighborhood in which we live. These are very, very big issues right now. For the Gulf states, there's no question. The existential challenge is posed by Iran, and the fact that Iran is in the throes of a profound four-way crisis, which involves the sanctions, the corona, the legitimacy of the regime, the collapse of the energy markets, all of this makes Iran even more dangerous, which means that the Gulf states, which are most, Qatar plays its own game, but most of them have become very, very worried about the level of American support under the present circumstances. See Israel as a mainstay of stability, as a strategic partner in the struggles that we may face together. So all of this modifies their behavior. It's not a question of complacency, it's a question of priorities.
Understood. I do want to get to the issue of public opinion a little bit more before we talk about the other players at hand. Your poll found that 57% of Israelis agree to claiming sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria, a small majority. Are you worried about lack of public support for such a move? How different is this from Ariel Sharon disengaging from Gaza and northern Samaria when polling produced rather similar numbers at the time and can be said to have ultimately tore the country into two even till this day?
Well, that was, of course, an act that involved the uprooting of 9,000 Jews from their homes in northern Samaria and the Gaza Strip. And even that, at the end of the day, did have the backing of maybe a narrow majority of Israelis, but it definitely, the government action, once it takes place, I think can transform reactions. Here we're talking about something else. We're talking about implementing a reality, or translating into legal status a reality on the ground that most Israelis believe, even those who would rather not tamper with the existing arrangements. They want Israel to remain in the Jordan Valley. They know that Gush Etzion and Ma'ale Adumim and the areas in Otef Yerushalayim, which are vital to the stability and security of the Jerusalem area, are going to remain Israeli under all scenarios. So I think that public opinion will, in this case, rally around a resolute action. We need to take into account that all the noises and the cross influences and the pressures and the threats that we are hearing now are all in an attempt to influence the thinking, the considerations, the decisions of the Israeli cabinet, the core group of Israeli decision makers within the next few weeks. But once a decision is taken, and then we move from decision to implementation, public dynamics in Israel will change, and I think also international dynamics will change.
Do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has enough political support to pull off such a dramatic action?
I think that there will be voices from within Likud arguing the hard right case. And there are, of course, voices on the left. But if you count the Israeli electorate, leaving aside the pro-Palestinian position of the Joint Arab List, and leaving aside the hardline anti-Palestinian position of Yamina, which says not an inch to a Palestinian state under any circumstances. If you leave that aside, I think that in that space, despite the swirling controversies over Prime Minister Netanyahu's personal affairs, you will find from Lapid to Likud essentially a broad range of opinion that would focus that can support a security-based phased territorial implementation.
And sorry. And how about the Europeans? There have been threats to downgrade relations with Israel since the whole talk became much louder. Is it really a threat? Do you see any sort of solution regarding the future of diplomatic relations between Europe and Israel?
No, I don't think there's a threat to diplomatic relations. If you want to stay involved in the Middle East in any way, you need an open channel with Israel. There are specific questions hanging, whether Horizon, the new Horizon 2027. I was involved in the negotiations of Horizon 2020. We faced some difficulties even then without the annexation question, so quote unquote, and we found a way to overcome them. I believe that at the end of the day, a scientific cooperation with Israel, being what we are now, on some issues, Israel is a superpower, from water desalinization to perhaps solutions to the coronavirus crisis. So denying yourselves the access to Israeli science, to Israeli knowledge, is not a very intelligent choice to make. People have been half joking. I don't know if you ever saw that caricature. The group of families sitting around a fire in a cave. And the child asked the father, how did we ever get there? Well, it all started when we began to boycott Israeli products. Because if you take out the chips from most portable computers nowadays, which are made in Kiryat Gat, and if you give up on desalinization technologies, which water and keep millions away from thirst around the world, and so on and so forth, if you actually make their choices, you're not serving the Palestinian cause. You're doing harm to yourself.
Okay, let's fast forward to the day after declaring sovereignty or annexing. What other parts of the Trump plan are we likely to see?
I think the proper term is implementing Israeli law. That has been the case in the Golan Heights, and that's been the case. But in Jerusalem, it was properly added to Israeli territory, irretrievable.
Okay,
but the proper term is acting the same way we did in the Golan in 1981, again to the dismay of many, but it is something that everyone now understands is an irretrievable reality.
Okay, so what are the next parts of the Trump plan we are likely to see implemented, if at all?
Well, down the road, I think we need to keep open the option of negotiations. I don't believe the Palestinians will make a decision before November, because they were definitely waiting to see what would happen with the American election. But on both scenarios, whether we have a second Trump administration, or for that matter, Biden administration, which would then have to consider whether they want to antagonize Israel all out, or whether they want to help the Palestinians come to the table and negotiate. I think we may, in either case, we may have an opening for negotiations in 2021. And we need these negotiations to be realistic from our point of view, which means we cannot extend sovereignty everywhere we want. And it also has to be realistic from the point of view of the Palestinians, which means there's no 100% solution that can be imposed by the international community. Anyone who dreams about a situation based on the uprooting of 700,000 Jews from their homes is smoking stuff which used to be illegal in Israel, but at the moment we are reconsidering.
Sure. We've seen up until now that it really matters who's in office for these things to occur. So what happens if Mr. Trump is not the president come 2021? If he loses, will the next administration reverse decisions? Could we go back to square one?
They might try to, but it never really ever goes all the way to square one. We've seen a situation in which the Obama administration, already in the transition phase, back in 2008, told us that they were scrapping a written letter of the previous administration, namely the exchange of letters between Ariel Sharon and President Bush on the 14th of April 2004. They were doing this to create imaginary daylight between the US and Israel, so the Palestinians will imagine that the US is an honest broker. Now, the verdict on this attitude, which may, the authors of that concept may have legitimately thought that they were serving American, Israeli, and Palestinian presidents by this interests by this device. The result has been delivered. For 8 years of the Obama administration, we did not go forward 1 inch. So if the next American administration chooses under all sorts of pressures from the growing left, and I have to say I'm worried about the apparent defeat of Eliot Engel in the Democratic primaries in New York. But if they are pressured into thinking the same way, endorsing the concept of daylight between Israel and the United States, this will not deliver for the Palestinians. Quite the contrary. This would all lock us into another fruitless cycle, as happened between 2009, when the Obama administration came in, and 2017, when they left, with the legacy of UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which is clearly non-implementable.
How confident are you of the ability to continue with this daylight policy, given the Democratic-Republican divide is becoming deeper and deeper? Do you think that that's something we can actually achieve?
First of all, I have to say, I'm looking at what's happening in America, politically, socially, physically, in parks and squares. I'm increasingly worried about polarization. Polarization is a disastrous development because it seeps over into the capacity of the United States to conduct rational policy in international affairs. So polarization is, for us in Israel, polarization in America is a very sad and worrisome development. There is a graph that shows how American congresspersons have been voting from the 40s to the 2000s. I don't know, it must have been updated in recent years. And you see from it's moving from a purple blob of red and blue voting more or less the same on key issues to something which is increasingly polarized along partisan lines. And for us to see our issues, which for many, many years were bipartisan, being drawn into this abyss is very worrisome. But we are not without resources. We have our own way of conveying our position to the American public and to Congress and to opinion makers. And we also can stand on our own feet. Israel is sturdy enough to take its own positions on key issues from Iran to the Palestinian question.
Understood. Going back to the day after, do you think that Benny Gantz will be able to pick up from where Netanyahu leaves off with regards to West Bank policy, considering the former was essentially forced into the plan in order to join the coalition?
Well, I believe that it goes the other way around. I personally tend to believe that Gantz and Ashkenazi joined the coalition, among other things, because they signed on to the Trump plan. Gantz was invited to be there at the rollout. They see the benefits for Israel, and Gantz has spoken to that, in breaking out of the EKP, breaking out of the everybody knows paradigm, and moving out of the present deadlock. And I think this is the ultimate reason why they wanted to join a government rather than leave Netanyahu locked in the grip of the hard right factions within Likud and outside it. And so I believe that the actual difference between Gantz and Netanyahu on these key issues, on Iran, on the Palestinian question, on the campaign between the wars conducted in Syria, and on regional cooperation, on all these issues, I believe that there is very little difference. The difference is of nuance, not of substance, between the two.
Interesting. We're almost out of time, but there are just a few questions left. So we'll get to those first, if that's okay. Do you believe that Israel's security establishment is equipped to deal with what could ensue in the immediate aftermath of the application of Israeli law? How can we prevent the blood spill that was seen the day the American embassy relocated to Jerusalem?
Well, first of all, we're learning. We have a learning curve, and the IDF is increasingly effective at coming to non-lethal outcomes in confrontations. Of course, if the Palestinians in Gaza once again try to breach the fence, it had little to do, by the way, with the move to Jerusalem, of the embassy to Jerusalem, and everything to do with Hamas plans, which have already been prepared and partially already implemented weeks and months before that, for reasons which are internal to Hamas and to their situation in Gaza. If they go back to the same way, yes, the IDF will know what to do, but we are managing the Gaza situation in a complex way, which involves the morally tainted but effective measure of allowing the Qataris to come in with suitcases full of cash. By the way, they have to do it because Abu Mazen is blocking all normal banking transactions with Gaza in order to starve his people into submission to Fatah, because for him, Gaza is a rebel area because it's under Hamas. So the Palestinians are not very vegetarian about killing each other or starving each other. But it is not our business to play into that game. We have come to some kind of morally, as I said, morally problematic but workable arrangement with the powers that be in Gaza. I think that's likely to hold. With the Palestinian Authority, they have very good reasons not to once again descend into the abyss of 20 years ago. There will be protests. I hope the IDF has learned the whole book by now of how to handle protests in ways which do not end up with blood dripping from our TV screens. And I think we have commanders who are very sensitive and sophisticated in this respect.
All right, so just two more questions, if that's okay. One is a follow-up question to something that was asked a little bit earlier. You've already established that you don't see a threat to diplomatic relations between the Europeans and Israel. The question is, do you see a threat to relations between Europe and the US or the Trump administration as sort of the patron of these acts of sovereignty?
I think there are such huge issues now between Europe and Trump on certain respects, ranging from trade to certain aspects, to even the question of nation-state patriotism, as Trump calls it, versus internationalism. This will be one more footnote in a long study of differences. And by the way, I'm not saying there will be no consequences in Europe. I'm just saying that they need and they can be managed. I don't expect collective action to be effective because we have friends today with whom we share vital interests in Southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere, for whom the commonality of interest is more important. But there will be, for example, I cannot rule out the possibility that a number of European countries will extend recognition to a Palestinian state. That's a painful act from an Israeli point of view, but it is something we can live with. We have very good relations with several countries which have extended long ago this kind of formal recognition to the Palestinians as a state, and we nevertheless can work with them. There will be symbolic actions. Some of them will be offensive from an Israeli point of view. But the overall, if we weigh all of this against the prospect of actually breaking a deadlock that has basically strangled any hope for progress for years now, then it may be worth the price.
All right, so just one last question. If we already have you here, I'd like you to share your thoughts about the developments on Israel's border with Syria. Actually, the occasional strikes against Iranian and Syrian positions attributed to the IAF are now part of the landscape. But Tuesday night's strike left a number of people dead, among them non-Syrian nationals. Do you think we are likely to see an Iranian retaliation? Do you think we're likely to see more strikes, an increase of strikes?
Well, the Iranians are looking for provocations and opportunities. Their internal situation is very difficult. The economic situation is almost disastrous. The Americans have moved out of the JCPOA. The Iranians are provoking the world by basically trying to rush their military nuclear program once again. All of this makes it absolutely vital for Israel to deny them the ability to use Syria and Lebanon to the best of our ability as a sword hanging over our heads. You know, it's a point that's been made by General Midro, myself, and others over the years. The reason why the extremely dangerous and provocative behavior of North Korea, specifically their nuclear project, which was in breach of all their commitments, was not dealt with forcefully by the international community the way Israel dealt forcefully with the Iraq case in '81 and the Syrian nuclear facility in 2007. The reason is that South Korea is too threatened by North Korean conventional military capabilities to tolerate any action by the West or to initiate any action of their own to stop the North Korean project. So the North Korean project just sailed away without serious hindrance. We are not going to let this happen to us vis-a-vis Iran. So it's regardless of the possibility of attempts at retaliation. And we saw this in the cyber field just a couple of weeks ago, trading blows with Iran on cyber. Despite the cost of counter operations by Iran, it's absolutely vital for us to prevent them from establishing themselves as masters in Syria. I think it's also vital for Assad, and it's certainly vital for his Russian sponsors to make sure that Iran does not have Syria as their playground.
Do you see, and just a follow-up question, do you see any option of the US changing its policy towards Iran in the case of change in leadership come January 2021?
Well, clearly, President Biden was part of the Obama team. He reveres the former president. He may try to bring us back to the JCPOA. He will have to bear in mind that in that case, Israel and our Gulf, I will not say allies, but those who are in alignment with our views on this matter, will possibly need to take action based on our own national interests, on our need for survival, and the American options will need to be considered in that light. We are not going to just sit here and say, well, if President Biden wants Iran to have the bomb, who are we to argue? For American Jews who speak that kind of language and don't argue with a popular president of the United States, I would remind them that Jews voted 90% and upwards for Roosevelt, and then what happened when Roosevelt faced certain choices that needed to be made and were not made. So this time we are not powerless. We will act on our own if left to our own devices.
Understood. Just one final question. I know that I've said that a few times, but they are still coming in. A clarification in terms of the importance of Jordan strategically. We talked about the Jordan Valley as a strategic location, and we did touch on Jordan itself as being important vis-a-vis Iran, Israel, but could you clarify whether you would agree with the assumption that many former officers of the IDF and diplomats too, who are saying that Jordan itself is our best buffer zone?
Jordan is part of the Israeli strategic envelope. And to protect Jordan, we need to be in the Jordan Valley. This is the core of my argument, and I believe that in their heart of hearts, the Jordanians know that as well. That if Israel is pushed out of the Jordan Valley, even if we sign an agreement with the Palestinians to stay for 20 years, but the pressures will begin immediately to bring it down to 5 and then to a year and then run us out. And if we are not there, Jordan will be in mortal danger of going back to where things were until 1970. Different Palestinian and other terrorist players, but a similar pattern. And this is precisely why I think that it is in our interest to hold on to our presence in the Jordan Valley.
Okay, that's nice closure from the beginning of the call. Dr. Eran Lerman, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Thanks again for joining us, and of course for your patience for going over time.
Not a problem, and glad to be of help. And I suppose we'll need to stay in touch. There are many dramatic things happening, not only in our part of the region. Look at Libya and look.
Absolutely. I'd also like to thank our Director General Uli Dromi and JPC's press coordinator Michel Irziel for putting together the call and making sure that today's briefing ran smoothly. I'd also take this opportunity to invite you all to next week's webinars in the series, beginning with Palestinian journalist Daoud Koutab on the future of Jordanian relations. Maybe we need to get him on a call with Iran first. And the kingdom's role in the Palestinian question next Monday at 11 a.m. Israel time, followed by a conversation the day after with former Knesset member Einat Wilf and publicist Adi Schwartz on the Palestinian national narrative in light of these political developments, Tuesday at 11 a.m. Thank you all for joining us and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.